Hello, this is Angela with Permaculture. I'm in the backyard of my permaculture garden here in zone 9A. Used to be 8B, but times are changing. So I have not made a video out in my garden in quite a while, and today's the day that I just want to start sharing things with you about the garden here. It's early April. I'm starting to be out in the garden more. I am really prepping for spring planting. Okay, I'm wearing sunglasses because I'm having an autoimmune flare. My autoimmune disease likes to attack my eyes and my eyelids, and so we're doing sunglasses today. That's just the way it is. Okay, so I made a couple of videos recently about cardboard and mulch in the garden. In particular, a couple days ago, I made one about, kind of a critique or a disagreement with the claims of a particular horticulture professor who says that you should mulch 12 inches deep with wood chips. And if you want to go watch that video, you'll learn more about my thoughts on why I think that's not an effective method for your average home gardener. And it's actually kind of really discouraging or unapproachable advice. So to tag on with that, I thought it would be good to talk about what I actually do in my own garden. My garden is 15 years old. When we bought the house, the backyard was 100% weeds, except for two things. If you walk through this cattle panel arch right to the other side of it, there was a split ornamental plum tree that was maybe about 15 years old, maybe 20 years old. And then way over against the fence line was ornamental Phylostachys bamboo that had grown along the fence line and was a nightmare and took me years to remove and punctured my husband's foot and broke many shovels, and it was a nightmare. So those three elements were all that we had in the front or backyard: weeds, sod, mix, and then split tree removed immediately. We paid to have the stump ground, and then that bamboo, which took us a few years to remove. Because it was very sunny and there were so many weeds, there was a significant amount of not only living weeds, but weed seeds, and then rhizomatous weeds, quack grass, which are difficult to remove. And my strategy was cardboard, plain corrugated cardboard, or newsprint 10 layers thick, and overlap them at least 2 inches so that weeds can snake up through, right? If you have a gap, you're not gonna have a good weed barrier. You need to overlap. And then I lasagna gardened on top. In some areas of the garden that looked like about 4 inches of wood chips, and in some areas of the garden that looked like layering in manure and, animal bedding that was pretty composted straw and hay. I'm bringing in spent mushroom mix or topsoil, compost. And then more wood chips on top, depending on what I was gonna plant, right? If I knew the area was gonna sit and quietly kill weeds and I didn't need to plant right into it, it just got newsprint or cardboard and wood chips and nothing else. And then when it came time to actually plant something like a blueberry bush, like a tree, then I would pull apart the mulch. I would take a box cutter, cut through the cardboard in a little X shape and plant into the soil underneath. So that was my strategy for suppressing and getting rid of weeds initially, and it worked great. The one persistent weed that I had in the garden was quackgrass, and it took a couple of years. And even now, occasionally, I will get a little bit of quackgrass coming up, especially in my rain garden. Those rhizomes can really stay dormant for a very, very long time. And so they're a very difficult weed. And I know in other parts of the US and wherever you may live, you may have similar species that are very difficult to get rid of. And then the other kind of weed that I get are weeds that blow in, seeds that come into my garden and germinate on top of the wood chips. Because they land on top of wood chips and germinate with basically no soil, those weeds don't tend to survive. They look very yellow and nitrogen deprived very quickly, and they die because they're basically sprouting on this carboniferous thick mulch with no access to the actual soil. However, nowhere in my garden could I use 12 inches of wood chips. That would pile wood chips up against my foundation. It would smother my perennial plants. Again, watch that video where I talk about why that's a bad idea. So I wanted to show you what it looks like now that my garden is more established, again, 15 years old, what my mulching routine looks like. I only need to add between 1 and 4 inches of wood chips in the garden. Now, sometimes I come in and I will top dress with compost because I have manure from my poultry. I have compost that I am producing around the garden. Intentionally or unintentionally, one of the big issues that I have with mulching with wood chips is that the wood chips break down into this wonderful, fluffy, loamy soil. but that means that I'm constantly building soil. In some parts of my garden, the soil is too deep and it is up against a shed or too close to my foundation. And that means I have to remove that beautiful, fluffy, rich material, and then I put it in my annual garden beds. So I'm often shuffling things around. And when I do that, I pull back any existing wood chips, put down any amendments. It could be also like rock dust minerals that I'm trying to remineralize my soil, especially because I live in a really rainy climate and things tend to wash through, right? So I pull back any old wood chips, add amendments, add compost, put the wood chips back on top, and then add a fresh layer of typically 1 to 2 inches, but in some places it's more like 4 around some of my trees. And I wanted to show you a little bit about what that looks like. When we are mulching with fresh wood chips, I have a lot of videos on wood chips, by the way. Some folks can get really concerned that your wood chips are tying up nitrogen in the garden and they're really bad to put on plants. It's totally fine to top dress with wood chips. What you don't want to do is mix them in to the soil structure, because then they will have greater consequences for your garden. But if your plants are planted into the soil, the wood chips or other mulch material is sitting on top of the soil, you're fine. You're not going to have any issues with low nitrogen for your plants from your mulch. So I only top dress. And then I want to make sure that when I am adding mulch around existing plants, I'm aware of where all my dormant perennials are. Now, maybe you mulch at a different time of year for me. And so you might decide that what actually works best for you is to wait to mulch until all your perennials are up and out of the ground if you can't remember where they all are. For me, I prefer to mulch early and have my perennials come up and through, because I find that it can be fussy to kind of tuck in mulch around them after they're already up. So I know where my herbaceous perennials are in the garden, and I'm adding wood chips around them, and I'm leaving enough room for them to come up out of the ground. If I'm only top dressing with 1 to 2 inches of wood chips, then I don't really need to worry about smothering them. But if I were using 12 inches, I would smother and kill my perennials if I didn't know where they were. Likewise, if I have an area where I have self-sowing annuals that I really want to keep proliferating, I don't add mulch until those have already germinated and they're coming up, because I don't want to smother them. So if it's like a fried egg plant, or it's my nigella, or it is nasturtium, something that I have as an annual that functions as a perennial because it self-sows freely and comes up every year without me needing to plant it, then I don't want to mulch too heavily and smother that. At the same time that I'm adding my mulch is also because I'm doing it in early spring, and I do add mulch again later in the fall, but if in early spring, I am also dividing any plants that I want to move around. So I often get little tiny plant starts, either start from seed, or I get a cutting off of somebody, or I buy one plant because I'm really cheap. And so I'm very patient about if I want to have like a big sweeping area, a big drift of plants in my yard, it can take 5 or more years for me to get my plants built up enough to have that. So in the spring, my little start, if it's big enough, I'm going to go ahead and divide it and move it down, and then I'm going to mulch around it. So it's sort of a joint effort of divide, replant, and mulch. It all happens at the same time. And then I want to be cognizant of when I'm mulching around trees, I don't make a mulch volcano, right? I want to pull the mulch back and make more of like a donut. I don't want that woody material up against the base of the tree, potentially becoming an issue with rot or encouraging suckers. Definitely, if I have a graft, there are some exceptions like medlars. There are some plants where the graft wants to be buried, but for most of your trees and grafted shrubs, you don't want to bury the graft itself. So I want to be really careful of where I'm putting mulch around those. Now, in terms of what the mulch is made of, I will take anything. I'll take anything, whatever chip drop brings me. Ideally, I would love those ramial hardwood chips, fresh maple. If I get a big load of maple chips from Chip Drop, like that's the best, right? Maple or oak. But because I live in the Pacific Northwest, where conifers abound, I'm probably going to get coniferous chips. And that's okay. They're a little more acid, but as they break down, they become pH neutral. And as fresh chips, if they're a little more acid, that's fine. They don't have a long-term impact on the pH of the soil, but I typically will put pine needles and stuff around my blueberries, things that love acid to begin with, whether that's more of like a homeopathic or wishful thinking addition or not, I don't know. If you really want to change the pH of your soil, we're talking about adding amendments like lime, sulfur, etc., etc. But since I mostly have access to coniferous wood chips, I put them everywhere and I have found no negative impacts. Folks ask about things that are allelopathic, like walnut, which is an invasive species here, so you frequently get black walnut chips because people are always removing them, or rhododendron is another one. And I haven't really found any significant impact. There is a study that was done a while ago that showed that the dew grown in walnut chips can take up to 18 months to break down in a compost pile. So if you're really concerned about it, maybe confine use of those types of wood chips to the path, if that's what you happen to get, and put other wood chip material on your beds. I'm not really picky, haven't really seen a negative impact from doing it either way. It is a good thing to note that if you have gourmet mushrooms or certain fungi that you are wanting to encourage in your soil and in your wood chip layer, that a lot of those, especially like Stropharia, Rugosa annulata, they prefer hardwood wood chips and not so much the coniferous. So I'm always requesting on chip drop, like, hey, can I get non-coniferous wood? That's my priority, but I'll take anything, because I know that my gourmet mushrooms prefer to not have totally conifer chips, right? So that's sort of my strategy for mulching. Now, because I live in a rainy area and my chickens are often out in the garden in the winter and my dogs are out, and when my plants are dormant, my dogs are not good about respecting the beds. When the plants are all up, my dogs don't want to wade through them. But when things are dormant, I find that they kick around and move around the chips. So that plus all the rain, come spring, my beds all really, like, you can often hardly tell that I had a couple inches of wood chips on them before, because they just break down so quickly in a mild climate with a rainy winter. And then you also have the mechanical force of dogs and poultry moving or breaking down wood chips. They have to be reapplied every spring and often in the fall as well. Okay, so you can see my seckel pear tree in bloom here, looking pretty good. Now, I had poultry in here all winter until about a month and a half ago. And you can see there are basically no wood chips left as a result of that. And there are a lot of volunteers. It looks like a lot of feverfew volunteering in here, and maybe also some motherwort and some radishes. And so I'm going to come in here and add wood chips later, but that's a bit more of a production because I actually have to remove this fencing. I have to unhook it and remove it in order to get space to bring a wheelbarrow in. Problem of plants getting bigger than I had originally planned. And then I will be putting wood chips down here. So that's sort of what's next on the garden chore rotation. And so my perennial beds really need for aesthetic's sake, so that my neighbors are not like, God, Angela, what is this hot mess you've got? And also just for protection of the soil from the future baking rays of the sun as we move into summer. I want to add all those wood chips now in April. I have been out here mulching, and so I'm going to give you an example of one small bed, which is a bed that I've grown potatoes in quite a bit, and I try to rotate my potatoes around. There will be volunteer potatoes in this bed this year. There's also good King Henry, which I put in, was it last year or the year before? So I'll show you what that looks like now, because folks always ask, how's your update on your good King Henry that you started from seed, which had very low germination and was pain. My plants are all doing well now, seem to thrive on neglect. And then I have some blueberries that I planted in here. These are rescue blueberries that I got off Craigslist, and one blueberry of mine that was in a bad location and has really suffered the last few years, so I radically pruned it. I've transplanted 4 blueberries into this bed. And then I also have kind of support plants, columbine and violet, that are beautiful, bring in pollinators, and you can sort of call them guild plants that are filling in this bed as well. So I'll show you what that looks like to mulch that. And then I'll show you some other little additions in our garden, some things that are not going well, some things that I'm dealing with, and some plans for the year. Okay, let's take a look at this small bed I was just sitting in front of. This is the bed that I mulched today. It is next to my wood shed. And like I said, it used to have potatoes, and I am cycling in more perennials here. You can see that I have some sedums, I have violets, I have columbine, and then I have these blueberries, including rescue blueberries here, which have been radically cut back, but they're still alive, so I'm hoping to regenerate them and get a good crop of them in this more sheltered location. Blueberries have really been struggling the last few summers with our heat events. Here you can see what the beds look like when I haven't yet mulched them. As I said, chickens, dogs, rain, the fertility of the soil all break the wood chips down so that you can hardly tell. Here, some dogs have scratched up my iris. You can hardly tell. There's a volunteer echinacea here. But the wood chips are really broken down, and I need to add more. Directly adjacent, you can see a section of the rain garden where I did add wood chips today, and the difference between the fresh chips here around my coastal strawberries, which are a great ground cover, by the way, the fresh chips here that I'm putting down about 2 inches thick all through this part of the rain garden. Now, the rain garden has a significant quantity of herbaceous perennials. And as I said earlier, I want to be careful not to mulch too deep, 1 to 2 inches, so that I don't smother any perennials and also self-sowing annuals. Coming back to the former potato bed, you can see here a specimen of good King Henry. I have 8 or 10 plants around the garden and they'll get quite large as the season goes on, but they're just coming up now. You can see I've carefully tucked the mulch around the base of the plant. I want to make sure that if I am transplanting, I am planting into the soil below and not into this fresh layer of wood chips. You can see here I have a number of perennials that I have divided and planted around the edge of this bed, and they will fill in as time goes on. So a quick, easy job of mulching a few inches thick in this bed. Very easy to do when the plants are still small and just coming up. By the way, this raised bed was made using scrap pieces of wood that were no good for firewood, kind of punky, and Scotch bottles. So all free materials for this raised bed. Okay, quick look farther down in the garden at staging the wood chip mulch. So here's my old wheelbarrow. Myself or my husband or my 15-year-old bring loads of wood chips down, dump them out and stage them. And then from there, I spread them in the paths or on the beds as needed. So at this time of year, I have these piles of fresh wood chips around the garden that I am slowly distributing as I have time and ability. Again, a look at these, mostly conifer chips with this load. I would say at least 80 or 90% conifer chips. Since I'm down here right next to it, I can't resist showing you my gummy berry in bloom. I have a few of these around the garden. This is Elaeagnus multiflora, a fantastic early bee food, and the berries later in the year are one of the favorite snacks for my chickens. Okay, back to the wood chip piles. Here's the good, the bad, and the ugly in my garden right now. Second wood chip pile here amongst the annual veggie beds where I have decomposing parts of last year's veggie garden. So I'm going to be working on spreading this pile of mulch into the paths that need a fresh layer of chips. Because I have raised beds here, I can mound up the chips more deeply in the paths. Quite a bit of mess in the garden. I'm always keeping it real with y'all and showing what's really happening. That is the chicken coop that we dismantled over the winter because raccoons ripped the roof off and killed some of our chickens. We are completely redoing our chicken coop. I'm going to walk up here really quickly. Our chickens have been living with our ducks over the winter, which has been a stopgap measure. We put some roosts in the duck house. Before I show you a longer term solution, here is one of my quince trees in full bud. It's going to be blooming soon and will look and smell beautiful. Okay, so here it is. Our neighbor Ben clued us into a friend of his that was getting rid of their small chicken coop, which will serve our needs for now, and we're grateful to have it. I'm going to paint it and move the chickens in here, and then hopefully when we get a larger coop built, we will be able to pass this along to someone else who can use it. I hope you enjoyed this video today, getting a chance to see what the early days of Parkrose Permaculture looked like, some of my thoughts on mulching with cardboard and wood chips, some of those pictures of what things were like when my kids were little and the garden was just getting going, as well as what I'm doing in the garden right now after 15 years here and how I use wood chips. I hope that you are having a good spring in your garden and that things are blooming and it is starting to feel like the garden season is getting going. My next video is actually going to tackle the issue of dandelions and whether they're good in the garden or they're not good. Are they all that they're cracked up to be? Should we save all the dandelions or is there something else going on there? Let's look at some of the literature. So thanks for watching today. Please don't forget to click like and subscribe, and I will be back really soon.